Okay, this discussion will be brief because after all, reading 11 is only a couple of pages. So postmodernism and the meaning of art. We've said quite a bit about postmodernism in this class. You have the chart that was put on the board either the first or second day of class. And then we had a unit on postmodernism in chapter 5. And so we're for the third time we're looking at it. It's obviously very important in anthropology, primarily because of the many truths idea as exemplified by the Tsimbaga example and their curious homesteading practices. Well, here the title is Postmodernism and the Meaning of Art. And the question here is simply, whose interpretation is valid? Should only the artist, for example, or the writer be able to give us a valid interpretation of their art? Or should anyone be able to give us an interpretation that will be considered valid? So we're going to read bits and pieces of this article, and then I'll comment on them as we go. Look at the 5th line. After all, it was argued, this is the traditional / modern view, in other words, pre-postmodern. After all, it was argued it was the artist that created the work, so it is the artist who would know exactly what it means or how it should be interpreted. Okay, well that's the old school, traditional, also essentialist is a term we use for that, take on things. Now drop down about 6 lines. It says, postmodernism challenges the more authoritarian perspectives. I sort of skipped the line there, went to the last word. Postmodernism challenges the notions of design, purpose, meaning, standards, and high culture, and takes this challenge to its logical extreme by establishing, for example, the reader of the poem or the viewer of the painting as the ultimate authority on the meaning of the poem or painting. We might say it's the ultimate democratization of art, is what they are suggesting. In the block quote from Death of the Author by Butler, here's what she writes. I'm going to read from the 3rd line. Attention to an author would privilege quite the wrong thing, foreseeing him or her as an origin or a delimiting authority, for the meaning of the text was an obvious example of the logocentric privileging of a particular set of meanings. Why should these not originate in the reader just as much as the author? Well, point being is that any interpretation is going to be based on some standards, some notion of value. And you have to assume those are valid if you're going to assume the interpretation itself is valid. And that's what this author is addressing there. Why should this be more true of an author or of a writer, of an author or a writer, than it is of anyone else? Very bottom of the page, postmodernists argue that privileging, for example, the artist who actually did the painting by accepting her interpretation of the artwork would be tantamount to accepting whatever worldview comprises the mindset of the artist. And then the artist would become the authority, and assenting to her interpretation would relegate others to a state of subjugation and an intellectual dictatorship. Now that's my words, and that is one of the ways I guess I would explain what it was that Butler was addressing above. Now, in regard to critiquing this point of view, I mean, I've elucidated the postmodern point of view, but now what about critiquing that point of view? Well, that is the last paragraph. That's what the last paragraph addresses. Read with me the first part of that last paragraph. Now we're switching gears. We're critiquing the postmodern point of view. One might critique the postmodernist democratization of interpretation by pointing out that all creative acts are motivated by some desire or need. In other words, there is a reason why someone wrote that poem or painted that painting. The artwork did not come into existence randomly and spontaneously in a vacuum. The modernist or anti-postmodernist can rightly point to a gap then that separates the creative act of the artist and the act of reading or viewing the artwork on the part of the audience. Skip down 4 lines. The reader or viewer is working in a state of complete ignorance, and thus their interpretation is simply an uninformed, idiosyncratic opinion that quite possibly has no relevance to anyone other than that individual. What I'm saying here is that it might help us to know something about the writer or the painter or the artist in regard to just biographical details of their life, maybe what their political philosophy was, why they were driven to create this particular work of art. And not knowing these things could put the individual in a sort of state of ignorance. Continue, while the state of affairs might be tolerable in the world of art, imagine what would happen to symbols and cultural ideals in general if this mindset were to become dominant. And I'm speaking of the postmodern mindset. There would be no possibility for order and organization, and thus a total lack of functionality. Not to mention that a sound and reliable understanding of the world would become impossible since, for example, alternative claims and ideas that challenge the standard theories and principles of science, no matter how inane or improbable, would be given equal consideration. Perhaps the postmodern attempt to delegitimize the author and the painter will never move beyond the world of art for these reasons. Well, I think I've mentioned to you before that postmodernism has been applied quite successfully to art and some of the social sciences, but has proven to be virtually useless in regard to the world of science, because science deals with knowledge beyond culture. And that's one of the points I'm making there.